Thank you, everyone, for joining. Just before we get started, how many people are working with the design system already at their company right now? It's a good amount. So what are we going to cover today? A little bit of introduction about myself, what the problem that we're actually trying to solve, what's the point of trying to build federated components, what they actually are, and then some guidelines that I've learned from my time in Netflix and now StubHub. So, little intro. I'm now a senior software engineer at StubHub. Our office is actually just across from the Memorial on World Trade 3 and 4. I've been doing this for about 18 years now, previously Netflix, Apple, New Relic, and IBM. My team here at StubHub is responsible for platform infrastructure for customer experience. Me specifically, I'm responsible for shared front-end infrastructure and for the design system. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? If you've been working with the design system already, design systems are meant to be generic. That's what they're for. They're great to do this. But what ends up happening is all your teams start picking up your design system and having to map their workflows to these generic components. Everybody has different requirements, but they're starting to use the same components, implementing the same data. If you're in GraphQL, all of the data has all been normalized. Everybody's using the same schema, which is great. Are we doing that in the components? No, because the design system is not meant to do that. And we don't want to change that. The design system needs to be as flexible as possible to evolve as quickly as possible with your business. But we do end up creating all this extra work and duplication when you have different teams, different parts of your organization. The bigger your company is, the bigger this problem is going to be. You end up with duplication that starts drifting away in some of these teams that are not necessarily working close together. And this data that's supposed to be all the same doesn't always get represented the same way. So when we started looking at this problem in Netflix, we set out a couple of goals to accomplish. First, we wanted to match the democratic principles of graph data into our components, right? We spent all of this time creating a single schema, stitching all this graph together, but we're not getting the full value of it on the component side. We want to be able to also better leverage the design system for specific domains. Right? This is going to be a layer on top of your design system with some business logic that maps back to your schema. We want to reduce some duplication. We also want to be able to provide shared workflows and infrastructure for our teams. And lastly, like I mentioned in the previous slide, we want to be able to standardize the representation of shared data. So this is where we come in with federated components. When I talk about federated components, what we actually mean is your design system plus your federated data, your graph data. This is not meant to be a replacement for your design system. We really want to build on top of it. We want it to be opinionated. And when I was working at Netflix, I had a certain opinion of what opinionated should be. And one of the things that I've noticed now that I'm at StubHub, you have to kind of step back and forth between the line depending on what your organization is. When I was at Netflix, I was working on some finance software. You could be very opinionated about your components. At StubHub, we lean very hard onto experimentation, and our engineers need a lot more flexibility to modify our components for our experiments really quickly. So we don't want to have to go back to the central team that owns the design system or these shared components to be able to modify things just for an experiment that's going to run for a couple of days. Next, it needs to be composable. When I say composable, I think a couple of people are going to know what it is. Last year when we talked a little bit about it, I didn't go into detail. So I'm going to this year to talk a little bit through an example of what we mean by composable. And then domain specific in the sense that it's going to be more closely tied to the data in your graph that you're trying to represent or to model in a workflow. So like I said, the first concept is we're not replacing the design system, we're building upon it. So what do we actually mean? I went back and forth in how detailed to make this example, and I ended up just picking something that I think most of us are going to have in our application. Does anybody here does not have an avatar in their application anywhere where we're representing a user? That's not too bad. It's better than I expected. So everybody's going to have something in the design system that they're using. Either their built-in, homegrown one. This one is based off of a snippet from Material UI. I didn't show all the props, but it's just some of the relevance. It should be pretty familiar to you. We want to be able to control the size, the variant of it, whether it's circular, rounded, or square, put some content inside of it, or display an image with an alt tag, ideally, so we don't break any accessibility rules. So if somebody's going to go use this with a base user fragment that we extracted from our GraphQL schema, we have first name, last name, the image of that user, and a title that they might have at the company. Simple little use. This is probably what we see in most of our code, right? And it's going to get repeated all over the place. You might end up extracting a little bit for this simple logic, but then it's very tied to how this is implemented. Some teams might want to extract a little bit that logic of calculating the initials to go inside the component so you don't have to think about it. They'll implement some of this. And then you start having all these different components in different code bases that are slightly different but trying to represent the same data. What we ended up doing is extending that interface for an avatar to represent a specific avatar for a user. Right? So we're going to take in an actual user fragment, and that could be extended in your schema and other places. You can have, for example, if we're talking about StubHub, a seller or a buyer user has different properties, but the properties that the avatar cares about are already in this base user. And then we're going to omit certain things from that component that wouldn't make sense to have. If you're setting the source or the content from the user, you don't want to be able to override that at the same time. And then you can start using this user avatar that simply takes a person and acts like almost completely the same component, other than initials, which is the children, and the source and alt. In this case, the alt tag can be the first name and last name of the user, whatever your company policy is. And then when it comes time for you to extend this, you have one component to change, and everybody who's consuming this component to display a base user gets that benefit. So, composable. We're going to build a little bit upon, and I'll mention back to that user avatar example. When we're talking about composability and components, what we really mean is something that would fit in a slide. It's very simplified, but it is passing components as props to other components to create higher order components. So instead of you passing a property of an object, you pass a component that is already pulling some of that data in there. It's a well-established pattern that's meant to reduce coupling between components and to allow us to future-proof some of these components. We don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time thinking through all of the permutations of the possibilities of a component use, because it's going to take us forever. We want to get this thing out to our users as quickly as possible. For example, in my case at StubHub, my users are other internal users of the company, and they want to ship things to, hopefully all of you are using StubHub, to all of you as quickly as possible. At the same time, we want to bring this flexibility to our own engineers. So like I said, our innovation teams want to experiment a lot. We want to be able to make this as flexible for them to compose components quickly. So a tiny little example that I have here, hopefully this is readable enough for everybody, but if you had a page listing for an artist at StubHub, I'm fetching the data from my graph. I instantiate my listing and I pass my artist. My listing has an artist header. There's quite a bit of coupling between the list and the artist header. And say tomorrow my design team tells one of my innovation teams that they want to trial out a hero header instead of the regular header to see if it converts more customers to purchase. Now, how are we going to do this? We're going to have to do an if or a switch statement. If we have multiple experiments running in this thing, it's going to become a giant mess, right? There's a lot of coupling going on in here. So the composable way of doing this, one composable way of doing this is pulling the header out into a prop, where you can pass a component for that header. And if we're using that example that I gave of substituting it for a hero header, this is pretty simple. Right? We can just swap it out. This is not the only way to do this. You want to be careful. Props are the easiest way to implement composability, but if you start adding 10, 20 props to your component, then you're not helping yourself either, right? And you want to rethink your pattern. If it's a component that's going to wrap a lot of other things and you don't necessarily want to force the users to have a specific layout, you can have a layout component, and you just add the children's inside. So if you want to change the order of the children, for example, one of the experiments we're running at StubHub right now, we want to change the order of the login, login as guest buttons. If you are taking those two as props, then you're going to have to clone that component and change the order. Or you're going to have to pass in some very complicated CSS to basically force a different order. And if you're passing components as children, you can just swap them. What about some guidelines? Because this grew organically at Netflix, we started with some very basic guidelines. The first one is to think about it a bundle of 3 separate concerns. The first concern being your GraphQL concern, your fragments, your queries, your mutations. If you're using TypeScript, that would also include all your TypeScript-generated types from your schema for those fragments, queries, and mutations. The second one would be your data fetching and management layer. So if you're, like most of us, you're basically using use a state and some context. That's what I usually would recommend for something that's shared across an organization. Say one of your teams is using Redux. Right? You want to give them the flexibility to replace just this layer, use your types from your fragments, and your queries, use your components above it. And then the third one is your composable components. We added something in the last year to this to include what we're calling recipes. And the best way to think of recipes is a group of your composable components put together as a solution. Those should cover what 80 to 90% of your use case for those components. But if you have users that need something slightly different, a different order, they need to inject another component, don't try to necessarily make that recipe too composable. They already have all the pieces they can put together in their own recipe. And this is one of the places where you can start watching where people are building their own versus using your recipe, and maybe learn, oh, we missed something. We can adjust our recipe a little bit, make it a little bit more flexible, or we got this thing wrong, we're just going to change it in the recipe. And the people that were using that 80% now get the same benefit that someone else actually trialed in an experiment. And then you want to take those 3 things and have them in 3 separate packages. So for each bundle, you're going to provide 3 packages, like I said. The one that I've seen most often replaced is that data fetching and management layer because the team's using Redux or some other form of data management, and they can still leverage your types, your definitions. They can fetch the data the way they want and then pass it to the composable components. And you want to make sure that these composable components are not really dependent on actually fetching the data themselves. They're more like dumb components that are just going to take props. These are some of the things that we added also more recently to try to guide people on how to manage these things once they built it. Try to group your federated components by responsibility. That's going to be different depending on how your company is organized. At Netflix, the design system had a central team, and my team in finance grouped a lot of the finance things in that area, and we were working with the team that manages the title, the show and movie metadata to provide components themselves for that data. It wouldn't make sense for us to put it all together in one team because trying to conceptualize the use of that data is very different. So the PMs for those teams are going to be thinking of different things. When I've had conversations with people, they sometimes will leap into, well, I could probably put this in my graph and define some of my recipes and composability of my components in the graph itself. Might work sometimes. Maybe you're trying to display the same layout and composition of components in a web view in native. In native, if you're not using React Native, you want to be able to have that layout defined somewhere. But what we've seen is it's a lot harder to debug problems that way, and it's harder to read, right? You can't just look at what's in the database and see how the page is laid out. This is what JSX and TSX was meant for. It's great at laying out your components in a tree. From experience, avoid owned ownership. We ended up creating a saying at Netflix that owned ownership is no ownership, because what we found is when a large group of people is trying to manage a massive monorepo of these shared components, everybody's being pulled in different directions for business reasons, and there are times where nobody's maintaining any of the components and things need to be maintained. So you want to try to kind of look back at the responsibility and keep that ownership as close to the data. So we've been recommending people, you own the data, you should own the basic components for representing it. Not always realistic in every organization. Some teams are not going to have front-end engineers. You need to find a way to kind of partner and give them that support, but they still, at the end of the day, kind of own the component, even if somebody from another team is assisting. There's a commitment to keep that maintained with a regular schedule. That's all I had for today. I have lots of time for questions. If you guys want to pull me over on the hallway and chat with me about it. There's a lot of it that's very dependent on how your company is set up, but hopefully the concept kind of hits a chord and it helps you solve some of the same problems that we've been running into. Now that I've seen it in 2 different companies and we've been able to provide the same solution, I'm feeling more confident that it's a pattern that can help everybody. Thank you.